So, you want to start, or maybe you have started, filming, but there's something off about your footage, whether it's just not quite looking right, or maybe not looking like somebody else's, or just doesn't have that right feel for you. You probably need one of these. So what is this? This is a variable neutral density filter. I have to say it slow because anytime it just rolls on my tongue, variable neutral density, it just sounds weird. Simply put, this is a sunglass for your camera. And because it's variable, I don't know if you can see here, it'll get darker. There we go. So you can actually have more sunglasses, or you can have less sunglasses. So what does that mean for video? To get that filmic, cinematic look, when you're filming at 24 frames a second or 23.976, in order to get that filmic, cinematic look, I hate those words, I'm so sick of hearing the word cinematic, you actually have to use a shutter speed that is double your frames per second. So because we don't have 1/148th of a second in most consumer level cameras, 1/150th of a second needs to be your shutter speed. So you might be thinking, okay, well, I can just use a lower ISO or just crank up my aperture, you know, f16, whatever, we'll move on with our lives. You don't want to do that because you don't necessarily want everything to be in focus in one of your films. So if you want to use 1/50th of a second, say f2.8, and you're filming in log, which has a native ISO of 800, you will absolutely not be able to do that outside. You probably won't even be able to do that inside either. So that is where a neutral density filter comes in. What you actually do is dial in your settings, as I mentioned. So if we're gonna go with 1/50th of a second, f2.8, ISO 800 in S-Log, you'll actually put this on. You're gonna slowly turn it until it gets darker. What that will do is actually bring down the general exposure and get you something that is properly exposed. Now, I filmed a couple of clips, nothing scientific, just to kind of show off the difference, not only in using a neutral density filter, but also what different shutter speeds will give you for a look, whether it's that C-word look that you're going for, or maybe you're trying to do something a bit more artsy. In any case, you can absolutely do. In this first clip here, by the water, it actually ended up being a cloudy day, so the sun wasn't too bad, which only helped the video a little bit. However, you'll see a couple of different options that I used to see kind of how these different things look. Because it was pretty windy by the water today, these next examples that you're going to see, the first two actually have the neutral density filter on there to kind of show you some natural movement. So this first one is 1/50th of a second, f2.8, and twisted my neutral density filter enough to give me a proper exposure. Now the difference between this clip and this next clip is that I bumped the shutter to 1/100th of a second. What that means is because they're swaying so much, they're actually staying a bit more crisp. They look crisp. Focus point is in the same area, however, there's not as much of that natural motion blur, giving you what is known as an overcranked shutter. You notice that in movies, a lot of high action movies, where things just kind of look a little different. That's actually called the Staccato Effect, because things are super crispy even as they're moving super fast. Saving Private Ryan was actually a great example of that, because with the explosions, with the fast movements of the soldiers, everything is just nice and crispy. There is no motion blur, or very little motion blur, I should say. So that's actually how you achieve that. I'll probably do a separate video all about different shutter speeds when filming, just to give you some insight to maybe some different artistic looks you can go for. I didn't have a model on hand today, so I wanted to record just kind of how a person looks using different shutter speeds, or just very quick movement. These are super easy. This first one, again, 1/150th of a second. I used f2.8, again, ISO 800. So you'll notice here when I'm waving my hands, there's a little bit of a blur to it. It just looks natural. It looks like what your eye would see when somebody's waving their hands around. However, in this next video, you'll see me waving my hand, and I'm actually using 1/125th of a second, so you're getting more of that staccato effect. You're getting a much more sharp movement. There's not as much motion blur, so it looks a little unnatural, but depending on the look that you're going for, might work for you. And lastly, I thought this might be a good example as well. I simply took some clips of me walking. So the first clip is 1/150th of a second. f2.8, ISO 800, again with my neutral density on there to achieve a proper exposure. And you'll see that there's natural motion blur. It looks pretty normal. The next one, I overcranked the shutter to 1/125th of a second, and you see it's a lot more crisp. You can really notice the detail in my shoes even as they're moving. And then just for sake of example, this last one, I used a much slower shutter speed, 1/20th of a second. So you're gonna notice that there's a lot more blur, almost this dream-like look to it. And again, if that's the artistic look that you're going for, that's when you could use that. With a neutral density filter, there are some pros, as I mentioned. You're able to shoot outside under bright light. You're able to maintain your shutter speed, actually keep a smaller shutter, so that way you can really give your video some depth and just allows you more latitude for filming outside. Now, there are some negatives to using a neutral density filter. A variable one like this, that once you do turn it all the way, you might notice some considerable vignetting around your frame, which again, if that's the artistic look you're going for, great. It can be fixed a little bit in post, but it will be noticeable once you really start to get to the max level of this. So be wary of that. Even some of the best glass will still do that. The other thing that you might notice as well is sometimes these neutral density filters will give you a color shift. So that again is easily fixable in post, whether it gives you a bit of a green, magenta, whatever kind of hue, you can always fix that in post. This is definitely a tool that you'll need in your arsenal if you're planning to start filming, whether you're going to be filming outside or inside sometimes. And you really want to make sure that you can maintain your shutter speed, proper aperture, and using a native ISO. I'll leave a link in the description to this one that I use. I think this one is $69.99. It's a ProMaster, which I had never heard of before, so I picked it up at a local camera shop before I went out filming one day, and I've been using it since. It's lasted me this long. I really don't have any complaints about it, other than the pretty heavy vignetting if I'm outside and it's extremely bright. However, there are ones that go up to $175, $200. But if you're looking for something a little easier on the wallet, definitely check this out. I'm actually going to do a video on the filter that's on my lens now because it's probably my favorite addition to my camera bag in the last year. It's on my lens for photos and especially videos. Leave a comment down in the description if you think you know what it is, but I'll be doing a video on that soon. So be sure to like, subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys soon.